Hi, this is Larry Bauer, Chief Executive Officer of the Family Medicine Education Consortium, and I have the pleasure today to be talking with Dr. Pat Jonas, a family physician who is just beginning his 41st year in practice. And Pat and I had a conversation. We've known each other a long time, and we had a conversation, and he was telling me about the discoveries that he's been making with Ehlers Danlos patients, or finding patients with Ehlers Danlos syndrome. And I thought this message was really important that we get it out to the family physician community, because there are people with chronic pain that are being mistreated or misdiagnosed, and I think Pat's onto something. So Pat, thank you very much for joining with us today.
Well, thanks for having me, Larry.
So Pat, why don't you tell folks your discovery?
Well, it's interesting in this era where we have a lot of people with chronic pain, the opiate crisis, and so forth, to start to discover. Like a few years ago, I had a complex patient that was confusing me, and it just suddenly hit me while I was doing a talk about rare diseases that it was Ehlers Danlos syndrome. So meeting with that person, we made some checklists, and I reoriented how I thought about things. So I started to look for Ehlers Danlos syndrome here and there, but then in 2017, they redefined the diagnostic criteria for Ehlers Danlos, which allowed people to get a thing called the hypermobility spectrum, so doctors could think more readily of this kind of particular diagnoses when they're seeing chronic pain people quicker. So the hypermobility spectrum, there's a simple test called the Beighton test that they bend your wrist and pull your thumb up toward your forearm, put your hand flat on the table and lift your little finger up, put your arm straight out and see how far the elbow bends. Do likewise with the knees. Then flat-footed, knees straight, put both hands flat on the floor. That's a 9-point scale. So that's a screening thing that family doctors can use to identify if people might be in this territory, especially if they have pain of the joints, neck, back, etc. So I got curious and started to identify more people with this as a result of using this simple Beighton screen and having these new chronic pain patients, since 3 doctors left their practice right around the corner from mine. They're kind of like pouring in with chronic pain, and many of them have this Ehlers Danlos syndrome, which has not really been diagnosed, which has some other possibilities for treatment and interventions. So it's kind of an interesting thing because there's all kind of pain. It's a surprise. It's a syndrome, and those can be difficult to diagnose, except in family medicine where we get continuity and we get more time with a person. We start to notice that their situation is not just one joint, not just one problem. It's multiple. What does it really mean? And that kind of curiosity kind of goes back to the principles of family medicine, where Ian McWhinney said we're supposed to kind of be curious and start to notice patterns in our population. So I noticed the patterns and found all these people, and it's been fascinating.
So Pat, you mentioned to me a specific number. So how many people have you found?
So I've probably diagnosed 50, and I've taken care of a few more than that, about 8 people that already had the diagnosis, starting about the year 2000. But more recently, like in the free clinic that I run in Bellbrook, I found 19 people with it. And these are people who are uninsured or underinsured, and their doctor quit, or they were fired from the job or whatever. So a lot of times it related to this Ehlers Danlos syndrome with the hypermobility, the dizziness, the orthostatic tachycardia. There's so many symptoms that they might get that aren't understandable that cause them to be absent from the job. So we see a lot of them at the free clinic, and then a whole bunch of them up here in our direct primary care practice where we have more time. So some of the people actually sought me out because I relate to a group with Ehlers Danlos, since I got sort of a reputation of at least understanding the definition of the disease. And then I went to the National Ehlers Danlos Society meeting a couple years ago just to kind of further clarify, because it was fascinating, and the people are kind of stuck, and they're discarded as drug seekers, or it's all in your head, or what have you. And it's a family thing, so it's just family medicine, and we should be kind of going after it.
So I recall when we talked that you mentioned that there's the Ehlers Danlos folks. They in a community they find each other and begin to develop a support group. What's your experience with that?
That's true. So they call themselves zebras because the phrase in medical school went from the great faculty. If you hear hoofbeats, don't think it's zebras, it's horses. So these people knew they were zebras, and they said, well, how do we get the doctors to pay attention to the zebras? So they named themselves the Zebras, and the Dayton Zebras is the local group. It has over 450 members, and they have a Facebook page and a monthly meeting at which they discuss things about their condition, about care of the condition, about doctors who care for different aspects of the condition. So there's a whole network of people nationwide also. And the big leaders in the organization, who a lot of whom were geneticists originally, pulled together the new diagnostic criteria in 2017, highlighted on the Ehlers Danlos Society webpage in incredibly understandable form. They started the ECHO. Remember the ECHO education in New Mexico for gastroenterology?
Yes.
So they actually subscribed to an ECHO project out of Indianapolis that can be signed into from the Ehlers Danlos Society webpage. Under professionals, it's the first thing you see, Project ECHO. So if you don't know anything about Ehlers Danlos and you want to learn, boom, 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 you got the videos, you got the ability to actually enroll as a practitioner in the Project ECHO and send cases to the quote-unquote experts who kind of work with you to help you to be more understanding of this syndrome in your practice and in your area.
So now that you're more aware and probably, well, you're more skilled at identifying people, what's the, how has it changed how you respond to and treat these people?
That's a good question. So one is I found when did it start? How did it all start? A lot of the people were in some kind of a trauma, and some were gymnasts or cheerleaders, and they kind of face planted or something, and they knew that their neck was out, that it was further out than other people. They were a gymnast though because they were hypermobile. They could do more things, or a cheerleader, or a ballerina, or a soccer goalie. Where the volleyball, some of the volleyball players are likewise, they're really good at it. So I have a lower threshold to think of Ehlers Danlos with those folks, and also to look for cervical instability and temporomandibular joint dysfunctions, because there's a lot of people with C1-2 problems that relate to the TMJs that cause them to have quote-unquote migraines and make them a chronic pain person and unable to work and so forth. So I've kind of looked at the chronic pain people in the more differentiated ways. And then syndromes, trying to figure out how do you actually diagnose a syndrome, which is a group of symptoms which consistently occur together. And this EDS thing has a whole bunch of genetics to it. So there's a new way of thinking about heritage and gene testing and genetic counselors and so forth. So I have like a little extra piece when I have to think of those kind of folks. It takes a little extra time, but it fits nicely with direct primary care. And on the patients that'll come from other practices, now that these doctors are all retiring or leaving, one of them died in the area. So we lost 5 doctors in this city of Beaver Creek in the last 10 months, family doctors. So there's all these patients floating around who can't get a doctor because they have chronic pain and the doctors won't prescribe opiates. So I'm getting some of those people and trying to re-diagnose them to clarify what's their thing. So finding some cervical spine instability, some TMJ problems, and then some folks who are just happy to have a diagnosis that kind of puts together their passing out and their constipation and their spine pain all into one package of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome.
So what's your sense in terms of their life course? If you're able as a family physician to identify them and to respond with that awareness, does that improve their, as you're initiating treatment, does it improve their functioning, or is this just something that the pain that people have to live with and just kind of cope with it long term?
That's a great question. So the functional status, so for anybody with chronic pain, if they're on opiates, every time they're in the office, they're filling out a form about functional status. So they're getting improved functional status, though, with getting their Ehlers Danlos diagnosed and starting to go into supportive therapies initially. And many end up doing Pilates or yoga or some things that kind of balance the joints, where they have to think about the joints a little bit differently. They have heavy blankets that some of them with proprioceptive problems use that help them to feel better and they're more stable when they walk around. They have we have people who are aware of how to help them to put their C1-2 back in place if it pops out. They can learn how to put their ribs back in place because some of them have ribs that pop out. That's not a medical concept, so if they go to an ER, hard for regular doctors to identify that, to fix it. So the people are learning a bunch of self-care things, which gives them a better life and better functioning ability to babysit the grandchildren more often. Some like lifestyle things. Life expectancy, I don't think changes very much. But a lot of the care of the Ehlers Danlos people, though, is not quote unquote evidence based. They looked for all the studies that said, how do you deal with all these different parts and the entirety of the person? And there's very little literature about how to do it. There's a lot of literature on parts care, but whole people care is a little trickier. So that's another hole in the system that can maybe slowly be filled in. Family doctors pick up more of these people, find it very interesting and challenging in some ways because there's a lot of dizziness in some of the folks and a lot of hives and allergies and another subset. But overall, when they get connected in the system, they're validated and reaffirmed in a lot of ways as a human being. So the meaning of their life, I think, increases and improves, even if there's not some kind of a life expectancy change.
So there's a lot that I hear among certainly residents and faculty and practitioners that because of what I call the hamster wheel system, they don't have enough time to do a deep dive with the patient. And there's a tendency to get frustrated, blame the patient, refer the patient, when in fact what they need is more continuity of care, as you're saying. So I'm wondering what's your response to those people who say, this is just, basically they're saying this is too complex for me. I don't have the time to deal with this.
Well, that's a great one also because they're kind of trapped in some ways. They're always looking at all these models that you and I have worked on many of them over the years in helping people to learn clinical decision making. So looking at the differential diagnosis, the heart and soul of part of the practice of medicine, or we use that acronym SPIT, serious, probable, interesting, treatable, as 4 things to make a differential for any kind of symptoms or whatever. I've added an S in parentheses at the end of that SPIT. So the parenthesis S is for syndrome, to remind the resident or the physician or me, is this potentially syndromic? And one can just make like a little comment at the end of the note, like syndrome, review at next visit. They're kind of adding up information slowly over time and admitting it's a continuity question. You're not going to diagnose a syndrome right now. Curious because you're seeing all this stuff in this chart, like, their kneecaps popped out when they were running in high school, so they're off the track team. Shoulder went out, they had a surgery there. They got the neck surgery, the spine surgery. The wounds healed poorly. Wow, what does this mean? Is that a syndrome? Well, we don't have time for that today, but make yourself a little note, put it in the next differential diagnosis. So it may take a year, 4 visits, 3 visits, a whole residency for somebody to kind of put together a syndrome. And that's the job of family medicine, though. I don't think anybody else can do it the way we can, except we don't have the time now, so we got to do our continuity thing as a primary trigger, kind of think syndromically. It's just like our genomic people said, well, think genetics. Well, that's kind of complex, but a lot of these things are genetic things. Ehlers Danlos is mostly autosomal dominant. there's two common types: the stretchy people, the people with the real stretchy skin, and the people with less stretchy skin or hypermobile joints. Two common types. A genetic test for one of those. So there's a genomic question that people can think of if they're heavy into genomics, or having to learn to think syndromically is like a new thing, and it's kind of a challenge. And an opportunity.
So what
Residents who get mad
Yeah.
should say, okay, I'm mad and I'm angry because this patient is just trying to make me mad. They can say, okay, is it actually a learning opportunity, and kind of put it to the next visit and just share with the patient, look, I'm kind of overwhelmed and frustrated about this because something doesn't make sense. But basically, can you come back a couple times and we can work our way through this in a couple months, another couple months, because there's a story here, but it's not a fast story. And maybe the patient will agree. Maybe that decompresses the doctor's intensity also.
So you've been doing this a long time. As I mentioned at the beginning, you're starting your 41st year, and you came to this awareness in the last 10 years. So that meant for 30 years, it wasn't on your radar. So now that you've come on to this, what's the effect on you and your joy in the practice of medicine?
Oh, it's a refresher. It's refreshing. Say, okay, there's people with needs. There's processes that we can alter to identify the needs better and to help people better. And now we're going through this crisis with pain and opiates and so forth. And the whole practice of medicine is being smushed by the corporate strategies that we're kind of adhering to or subscribing to. So I think it sort of says you can always have fun as a family doctor, but you can always be needed. And also there's kind of a duty imperative. Say, okay, it's our duty to keep learning. I love things like Ian McWhinney's textbook of family medicine, which has the principles of family medicine to keep learning. I'm looking at that this month with a medical student with me. Again, there's good stuff there, and processes are really important because the processes seem to win out. If we keep going with the process, the content will be identifiable as we honor the process.
And Pat, when you're referring to process, are you referring to continuous care relationship?
Yeah, it's a relationship over time and seeing their patients as a population at risk. And the family physician seeks to understand the context of the illness, and then people start talking about, my sister has this too, my mother, and blah, blah, blah. We have some good things that help us to focus.
Great.
Physicians
So
see every contact with this patient as an opportunity for prevention or health education, etc. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, if others wanted to follow in your footsteps, what were the first few things that you would recommend that they do to learn more and to follow up on your learning?
Wow. So I love some of the original writings in family medicine to get the principles of family medicine down, to keep reapplying them. And I love the family part of family medicine. For 38 of those 40 years, I took families only. And I learned so much from families because they make each other sick. They tell on each other. They have genomes. They have stress. They have just all kinds of coping strategies. So I like those the old literature, the processes that were invoked by those, and the family kind of gets us going. And then just loving the human condition, the humanity of the people, it just never ends. It's ongoing, and trying to kind of clarify what's the human condition, what's the quest all about. So curiosity is a critical thing, and being kind of a warrior for what seems to be right, whatever right is.
Well, what's certainly right is that there's a bunch of people out there who are sort of marginalized and ignored or mistreated, actually, by the healthcare system, and being willing to devote the time and build the relationship that can heal that, at least to some extent.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's rewarding, satisfying, not without tension, and just like good family medicine kind of stuff.
That's great, and I think, Pat, that's a good point to finish. I will mention that Dr. Pat Jonas will be presenting his work at the 2019 FMEC annual meeting in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, November 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. And so if you'd like to connect up with Pat in Lancaster, that would be an awesome thing. Pat, would it be okay with you if I gave your email address to people in case they heard this talk and wanted to reach out to you afterwards?
Sure.
Great. So, Dr. Pat Jonas, thank you so much for what you're doing and for sharing that so freely. I am really hopeful that your words here will help some people rethink their strategies for working with people with chronic pain. Thank you, Pat.
Okay. Thank you, Larry. Take care.